My name is Nancy Kwok. I'm the director of the Institute of Arts and Humanities. Again, delighted to welcome you to this event. I thought I'd start by just introducing the Institute briefly. We are an interdisciplinary group at UC San Diego dedicated to fostering greater learning in the arts and humanities. And we have undergraduate programs, workshops, and talks. And I encourage you to follow our Instagram page or our website to stay up to date about our events. Now, this specific panel, What Does an Abolitionist Asian American Politics Look Like, is actually the first in our year-long series on building communities and abolitionist futures, and it is co-sponsored by Cal Humanities and UC Irvine's Humanities Center. I also want to make a point of highlighting the critical organizing labor of two people whose names actually don't appear on that flyer advertising our event, namely Simeon Mann, the first director of the brand new Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies program here at UCSD, and also the associate director of IAH, and also Anna Marie Buenviaje, who is the events and fiscal specialist who organized, coordinated, and advertised this event. So I'll pass the mic to Simeon.
Thanks so much, Nancy. I want to just say a quick word about the Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies program at UCSD. So the program has been a really long time coming, thanks to the work of many undergrads, the Coalition for Critical Asian American Studies, and in particular, the queer and trans API student organizers who played a leading role year after year to build institutional support for this program. So I am really thrilled that the program is finally here, and even more so that that the program is being launched by today's event and conversation about abolition. So I'm not going to say too much more. I want to turn it over and actually introduce Anna Marie Buenviaje, who is our fiscal specialist and events coordinator at the IAH, really echoing Nancy, without whom this event would not be possible. So Anna Marie.
Appreciate you both. Thank you so much for the kind words. It's really an honor to help, serve you guys and help put this event on. And I'm excited for the conversation and everything that's going to happen. So thank you again. And I'm just going to pass it over to Dr. Yang to introduce our panelists for this evening.
Hey everybody, Wayne Yang, I'm a professor in ethnic studies here at UC San Diego, and I'm just very fortunate to be able to facilitate this panel of people who practice abolitionary work. So this is not a philosophical discussion today. And I want to first acknowledge that we are zooming in from Kumeyaay land, and that the Kumeyaay are actively resisting forms of militarization, incarceration on their land, as you could probably tune in to see the sacred sites that they're protecting against a proposed or attempted construction of a border wall right now. And I want to frame today's, with just a few minutes conversation. So a little bit about abolition. So we're going to resist the temptation to try to put abolition into a box, but I want to put into a history, it is a history that goes back very far. It's often identified with white abolitionists within Europe and North America, but arguably it begins with the Black radical tradition. And so Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is the scholar, writer, abolitionist, notably she wrote about the expansion of the prison industrial complex. As we know today, it is, I don't know how many times, 10 times bigger than it's ever been, even a decade and a half ago. But she says notably that the Black radical tradition was created when the first indigenous African person was taken into captivity. And it has been this tradition of fighting for freedom ever since. And she also says that you don't have to be Black to be part of the Black radical tradition. So I'd like to ground this idea of abolition in a very, very long struggle. And it's not simply about abolishing police or abolishing this or that. It is a long struggle for freedom. Abolition has many, many dates, which I'm going to run through really fast. France abolished slavery in 1794 and then reinstated it in 1802. 1804, Haiti became the first country to fully abolish slavery in the quote unquote modern world. 1807, the United Kingdom outlawed international slave trade. Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833. We were exempted from that in the United States because we were free of the British Empire. And these dates continue up to, let's say, 1865 with the 13th Amendment, where the United States apparently abolished slavery, but actually at that time recodified it as legal. So Avery DuVernay's documentary 13 shows that well, how the 13th Amendment actually codifies and makes legal and permanent slavery as part of the criminal justice system. So why Asian Americans and abolitionist politics? And I want to note that the new program that Simeon finally manifested as truth, the API minor here, there is the Pacific Islander part of it. And there's a larger coalition of students called APIMEDA, which is Asian Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern Desi American. We are focusing on Asian Americans specifically because of the way that Asian Americans are implicated, both directions, in abolition or anti-abolitionary work. And the positioning of Asian Americans, which is a very diverse group by itself, but as a wedge group, as a sort of racial police line in the United States and North America. Viet Thanh Nguyen, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, writes about the Hmong police officer, To Thao, who was there at George Floyd's murder. And he says, in the video I saw, Officer Thao is in the foreground and Chauvin is partially visible in the background. George Floyd's head pressed to the ground. Bystanders beg To Thao to do something because George Floyd was not moving. And as he himself said, he could not breathe. And what Viet Thanh Nguyen says is at that moment of turning your back by policing the crowd trying to stop the murder, that the Asian American minority, it's a model minority moment, right? And that this moment where you are enlisted into the white supremacist project is the model minority moment. And we can see this throughout history. So, even the popular history on Asian Americans in this country, let's say Chinese working in the railroad, well, Chinese laborers in the railroad were exploited and they were also positioned to compete with free Black labor, right? Universities, which we're in right now, you can see the attacks, white supremacist attacks on racial equity at the university level in the form of lawsuits. They keep trying to recruit Asian American students to be plaintiffs against their universities. The notable example of this, one of the first ones was Harvard University, and I think no Asian American students ever agreed to be plaintiffs. But that is this recruiting of Asian Americans into the anti-Black, anti-POC movements. And the other interesting thing that Viet Thanh Nguyen points out is that Hmong people were actually the bodies who fought and died in illegal secret wars in Southeast Asia. And so you can actually see in the militarization of in the imperial battles of this world, how Asian bodies are also positioned as the sort of proxy for imperial wars. I wanted to put a plug in for a very, very important film that people should watch. It's just released. Let me stop my video really fast so you can see this. It's called Down a Dark Stairwell. Hopefully this is showing up, by Ursula Liang. And it is about the 2014 murder of Akai Gurley by Chinese American police officer Peter Liang, right? And so this film is probably one of the most important things to happen in Asian American documentary in quite some time. Brian Hu, the artistic director of SADAF, San Diego Asian Film Festival, calls it the most important film probably since Who Killed Vincent Chen. And it's going to be a live Q&A with the director. You can register for it. It's coming up. I think DJ Cuttin Candy might be one of the people in there who you're gonna hear from today. So getting my video back on. So I think as audience people, I'm wrapping up and I'm gonna introduce the panel really soon. I would ask that we think about how Asian Americans are positioned in the racial order, right? And what are we going to do about our positioning within that racial order? And therefore, the question is, what does an abolitionist politics look like? It's an open question. And today we're going to hear from community organizers, scholar organizers, artist organizers about their practical and direct experiences in abolitionist work. It's a conversation about the practice of abolition, which can take many forms, and it's not going to be a philosophical conversation about the word abolition. And if you could start turning on your videos, I'll introduce people in sort of the reverse order they're going to be initially speaking. So DJ Cuttin Candy, you will, if you tuned in early, you're listening to a track with her on it with Bamboo. And it's called, what is that track called again? Home Cooked. So I would recommend that. I first met you through your music. I'm not going to read everyone's bio. I'm just going to mention the organizations they're representing. So Candy today is representing Asian Solidarity Collective, as well as the People's Collective for Justice and Liberation. Rachel Kuo, who is the founder and co-leader of the Asian American Feminist Collective. She's also active for 8 to Abolition and is calling us from the East Coast. And last, but probably first to speak, will be Paul Suk. And Paul is an organizer with Justice Coalition LA. Again, look up their bios. They are really impressive people, and you hear a little about their story today. So, panelists, welcome. We're gonna run this much like a conversation also among the organizers that we are lucky to be able to witness and observe today and experience. So the first question, and we're only gonna ask 2 before we start the conversation. The first question is, for you, what has it meant personally as someone who may identify as Asian American to practice abolitionist politics? And if you could tell us about this through a specific story or set of stories or examples, how you came to see the importance of abolition and how you embody and practice it in your work. So we're going to start with Paul.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining. Thank you for this space, of course, and it's just really wonderful to share space with other folks that also identify as Asian American or just Asian in general. Oftentimes in my work, in my spaces of work, I'm one of maybe 2 faces at most sometimes. In a lot of big spaces, unfortunately. But overall, how I came about to abolition and kind of that way of life is my own personal experience, my own personal impact. And so it's not, I didn't come to it from a place of any abstract thinking or visualizing and seeing how others were struggling or anything like that. It was just my own personal experience of having, one, been a child of a refugee, being brought here as an infant, and seeing how my family would struggle. Acclimation didn't go well, and family fell apart. And these are similar struggles that I saw in the community everywhere. And so I thought it was normal to be kind of that way because that's what I saw growing up. And other families were the same way. Folks from Southeast Asia all had the similar experience. And unfortunately, a lot of us, as we grew up, we end up encountering the criminal legal system. And we encountered it from many different ways. For me, it was, after losing my dad, who became a single parent by then, when I was 16, while I was in high school, junior year, he passes away, and I go into the summer and there's really no support in the community, right? There's nobody out there for a youth center. There's no community workers, no health worker, outreach workers out and about. There's nothing. The only thing that was in the community was a man with a badge and a firearm, gang units on the corner waiting to harass me, when I set foot out the house, to pull me over and ask me questions. What's your name? Where you from? What's your birthday? What's your social? All these other questions. And then ultimately lift up your shirts. Let me see your tattoos. Like, who do you run with? Kind of that harassment was all I had. And, from that really pushes folks away. And for me, dealing with grief, I had a really hard time. And so that pushed me away even further to kind of find the supports I was looking for. Unfortunately, the only supports I could find was in the neighborhood, right? And oftentimes the neighborhood is not always a productive place. It's just because there's no other resources for folks as well. So everybody's struggling and grappling with the same kind of things, right? And so in a society where, we need money to function. Like, we can't do it without it. We need to keep a roof over our head. We need to put food in our stomachs. We need to have water to drink, et cetera. It's just essential. So I got myself caught up in different things, underground economy, and eventually end up getting tried as an adult at the age of 17. But what really led me to that path also was, when school started, I went back to school. Summer went by, couldn't find a summer job or anything. So I went back to school and said, hey, I need some help. Ultimately, their solution was, here's a slip, sign this form, turn in your books by the end of the day, go to this other location. And it turned out to be a packet school. Just because the schools didn't want to deal, they didn't want to provide any support, or they didn't have any to give out. to be honest. And so I got pushed out, and that ultimately put me into the streets, right? And so at the end of the day, I ended up getting caught up in the criminal legal system and getting tried as an adult at 17. I ended up getting 23 years, 8 months. I go off to the prison system. This was in the late 90s. And not until 2015, I get an early kick because of some legislation that folks in the community have worked on to try to get legislation passed to say that folks that went in under the age of 18, we need to show them some love and give them a way out. And so with that, I was able to get out. But unfortunately, because I wasn't born here, I didn't get released. I got transferred. I got handed over. I got put into an ICE van and taken off to who knows where, right? And then from there, longer journey behind all of that. But I ended up getting caught up in the system, went all over the US a little bit, crazy journeys, crazy travels. And then I finally do make it out because at the time, Cambodia didn't issue a travel document yet. So I sat in ICE detention, and I hesitate to call it detention because to me, it was just another lockup. It was just another concrete and rebar, same functions as jails and prisons, right? The only difference is it's mostly brown folks, some black folks, and a handful of Asian folks, right? That are kind of in this space together. But solely for the fact that because we weren't born here. And with that, I ended up walking out under an order of deportation. Mind you, this is my first day as an adult in the world that you could saw. It's the free world, if you want to call it that. In one hand, I had an order of deportation. In another hand, I had an order to go report to ICE. And in my bag somewhere was an envelope with instructions to go report to the state parole office. And so that was like my first experience as an adult in the United States of America outside of confinement. But with that, I ended up back in the community, went to South Central LA. Folks know me more as South LA nowadays. But I was staying there, connected with folks, just got involved with the community, started connecting with people. And then ICE sent me a letter and they said, hey, you got to go report. You got to come check in. And with that, I ended up reporting. They ended up taking me back in. Instead of plane, travel document was here, they're gonna put me on a plane, whatever. Ended up going back into the system. And then folks from the community came through. They started visiting, said, hey, what can you do? What do you need? How can we support you? We want to see you here. And because of that, I ended up making some agreements with them. I told them, man, they said 2 weeks the plane will be here. And if it doesn't get here, I'll go ahead and file. And so I used the legal knowledge that I had to teach myself while I was incarcerated over that period of time. And so, that was more like jailhouse lawyering, right? And so I used those skills to litigate, end up being able to get my release again through a bond. So it wasn't a release, it was a bond. I didn't have any money. So again, it was community folks coming together to pay this. Community folks encouraging me, community folks coming to support me, community folks pulling me out. So it was always about community. It wasn't about lawyers stepping in because I didn't have anybody representing me. I had to do all my own memos and all that from inside of a locked box, right? And so this is a different type of place. But while I was in that predicament, I saw some very, very interesting things. For one, most folks there couldn't speak English. And when you go to immigration court, the US attorneys that are working for the government and the judge, immigration judge, they all speak English. They throw numbers and all kinds of legal language out there that folks really don't understand. I was able to understand it because I had some form of English, right? I could actually read and stuff like that. I can access the law books that they had, which are all in English, right? And so that was just something that I saw as a personal experience. I saw folks really struggle through that. And so when I made it out, I got involved with a campaign in LA known as the LA Justice Fund. And what they were doing, the goal of that was to provide support from the county to have people given removal defense, so deportation defense attorneys while they're fighting deportation cases if they were residents of LA County. Unfortunately, there came a point where there was exclusions put in. They said if you have certain type of convictions or whatever, you will be excluded. And even though I wasn't looking to get it for myself, but for other folks in the community, I became kind of that central figure because now I became that person, that impacted person. Like, hey, you're saying this person is a no, you can't give it to them, but you can give it to this person, etc. And so through that, I ended up connecting with folks through the Youth Justice Coalition. And that's where I met. Young folks pulled me in. And ultimately, at the end of the day, those young folks gave me the platforms that I needed to do the work that I continue to do today. And at the end of the day, because they were so open and so willing to support me in any way that they could, I was able to get a pardon from Governor Jerry Brown in 2018. And that's how I ultimately got my status back. But definitely, so the way that, I come to abolition is from that. It's from that understanding that all the money that was put into incarcerating, all that money that was spent, and all those years of locking me up, at the end of the day, that money didn't really do any good. The good that it did, that came to me, or the good that I found, was in community folks. It was in the folks that wanted to support me. It was in the interpersonal relationships that I have with folks. It was with folks that were willing to reach out and say, hey, you know, like, what do you need? How can we help you this time while you're incarcerated? You know, those are the things that helped me to learn. It wasn't the concrete and the rebar. It wasn't sitting there in this box that was like making my life any better. And it didn't prepare me to come out. What prepared me to come out was investment in me as a human being from another human being, right? And so I want to encourage folks to think of, when we think of abolition, a lot of times folks think about, you know, like the system as a whole. And some folks have told me, well, part of the system is the community. I said, no, the community is its own thing. They're not invested from the government. When we think about systems and what we're trying to abolish and what we're trying to get rid of, is these systems that are suppressing people. Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, I sit on the CalVIP ESC, which is California Violence Intervention and Prevention Program, Executive Steering Committee. And this year, or this cycle, there was a $30 million pot of money to go to the community. And, you know, I sit in this space and there's like chiefs of police and stuff there. And I'm there and just like, hey, honestly, your gun and your badge is not always the solution. You know, like, that didn't help me when I was 16, when I was 17. Your brand new jail right there down the street, that didn't do anything to stop me. Like, that is not the solution. What I needed was an outreach worker. What I needed was somebody to come check in on me. Hey, how you doing today? Do you have something to eat today? Do you need anything? How can we help you? Like, if I had that, my life would have went a whole nother way because there was somebody there to embrace me. Every time I stepped out, the system did not embrace me. The system suppressed me. The system oppressed me. The system harassed me when I stepped out of the house. If I was out late at night, I was always getting pulled over. Oh, why are you out here? What are you doing? You got any guns on you? Like, this is always the stuff that comes at us from people with badges and firearms, right? And so that's the system that we're talking about, the system that suppresses people, the system that oppresses whole entire communities. And so at my organization, we work a lot with young people, and, you know, we're trying to divest from that and bring in supportive systems and supportive networks. And so that's where my framing comes from, looking at not only, you know, what happened to me, but what I still see happening today, 20 plus years later. It's still the same stuff that's going on in our communities. People don't have what they need. People are being forced to fight over little crumbs that are being put into community to survive and thrive, right? And so if folks aren't given those abilities, like, where are we really going in life? We're going to continue to have a system that's just continually pressing down on folks. And so that's where my work and my politics and my ideas and everything comes from. It's from that lived experience, but also being encouraged by a lot of the young folks that gave me the spaces that I need to get to where I need to go today.
Thanks, Paul, for sharing just a little bit of your story. And it does remind me also about a story of a story that might resonate with you, about Harriet Tubman. So Ruth Wilson McGilmore, who I mentioned earlier, tells a story about Harriet Tubman, who tells a story about a man who was released from prison. And he talked about just walking and walking and walking till he finally made it home, and his town was gone and nobody was there. And he said, there was no one there to take my hand and welcome me back into the world. And Harriet Tubman said that's what she wanted to be. When she made it to freedom in the North, she kept going back to take people out of slavery because she wanted to be that person to take someone's hand. And so that idea of the human contact as being abolition just really resonated with me. And I wanted to acknowledge that with that little bit. So next, I'd like to hear from another organizer who was so humbled to mention to me in the chat that y'all can't see that Rachel Kuo is not the founder of Asian American Feminist Collective, but one of the co-founders and co-leaders. So Rachel.
Thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to be in conversation with you all, and also to see so many people in this webinar who are really committed to having this conversation and learning more. And I think where Paul really left me with, right, is like the importance of how do we move past a me first politics that foregrounds this like idea of scarcity. And I think what I've really been thinking through, right, is that Asian America as a set of politics and as a political formation, and how we think beyond narrow individualistic and nationalistic models of recognition towards a kind of collective insurgent politics. And so I think it was Rachel Herzing, who's one of the abolitionists, like foremothers, where she said that we have to be rigorous but not rigid in our politics. And I think for me personally, this really means a commitment to growing a kind of political imagination. And so I shared in other spaces that I first came into this question of abolition when I started learning about community accountability and transformative justice in my early 20s after an experience with sexual violence, right? And I share this because I think a lot of people come into abolitionist organizing in spaces after surviving violence and encountering violence. And I think for me to kind of think through also this question, right, of like the delineations of what counts as violence and what is like the kinds of violence that we also endure every day, and how does that bring us to a set of politics. For me at that time though, like 10 years ago or so, I was really unsure of what to ask for from the people in my life and what repair could look like. And I just remember one of the things that I felt really clearly was that the criminal justice system was not going to be the space that I went to, and it wasn't the space that I was interested in pursuing, right? And at the same time, feeling really limited in any kinds of options, since any validity of these experiences of violence are often tied to formal systems of reporting that ultimately link to the carceral system. And at the same time, I was working in higher education and having this really difficult time reconciling how incidents of campus assault were being treated, especially amongst students of color, right? Like that the ways that justice and redress happens is really around forms of punishment and excising people from a community. And so for me, the book, and I'm also, my other hat is being a scholar and academic, so I am a big nerd and I look to books a lot at a time when I'm looking for things to kind of like place a name to my feelings. And for me, the book, The Revolution Starts at Home, was something that really changed things for me as a way to start imagining alternatives to creating safety, centering survivors, and finding accountability for harm without relying on the carceral state, right? And to also name that this book, The Revolution Starts at Home, was by Asian Americans who were in abolitionist organizing, right? Like Ching-Yen Chen, Leah Lakshmi, and Jay Dulani. And so like, that as a text was a moment, and this moment in time was really something that seeded something in me. And I think over time, right, like beyond growing a political imagination, I think we also need to ground that imagination in a kind of organizing work. And so to kind of pivot a little bit, so I was living in New York City and got involved in several different campaigns, and a lot of my work within movement spaces is through media making, and that shaped a lot of my learning and growing. And so through the process and the creative process of making media materials has been a kind of space where different conversations and relationships of shared learning and growing have really occurred. And so two like different campaigns that I think can kind of connect some of the things that we've been thinking through. One was that I worked closely with the New Sanctuary Coalition on a set of materials around a world without cages and a world without borders, and that how that really began to help me articulate the ways that our systems of mass incarceration and anti-immigration are deeply intertwined, right? And the ways that immigration laws, anti-immigration laws like passed in the 90s, set up and expanded our current detention and deportation system. And that was set up by the Clinton-Gore administration, right? And like in this moment, really thinking about the ways that also the Democratic Party needs to be held accountable and undoing a lot of the carceral legislation that they've helped like to pass. And so I think that's something to really think about and reckon with. And building on that work, a couple years later, I got involved in a prison abolition campaign against a proposal for borough-based jails expansion. And one of the reasons I had heard about the campaign, though, was also seeing a friend in housing organizing put out this long series of tweets of how the jails expansion plan was also going to displace working class and low-income immigrants and people of color from their homes. And so these links between abolition, housing, and immigration was something that I was starting to track. And so those were just two examples of at least like New York City based things around media and these different ways, points of connection across campaigns that really, again, started like seeding things for me. And another thing that I've been getting more involved with is doing inside-outside organizing and making zines. And even in this time of digital organizing, I think one of the things I've been reflecting on is how paper is still this extremely important medium for organizing and building community. So I think that's something that I'm happy to share and talk more about later. And then I'll end with like, I think in terms of practice, I think the other thing I've been reflecting a lot about from these different campaigns and spaces is the ways that we practice abolition within our movement spaces. And having really wonderful conversations with friends that I've met through organizing around, like, not only do we align on what we collectively fight against, but what is it that we collectively actually care for, right? And so for me, one of those things is nurturing Asian American feminism as a political home and building up a radical leftist Asian American politics and caring for that as a space of political mobilization. And so I'll end there and pass it back.
Thank you, Rachel. There is a question in the chat, if you could answer it, about how to access those zines. I also just want to amplify what you said about building alternatives to prisons, to the carceral system as abolitionist work, and the imagination, because what everyone says is abolition is impossible, right? And so like the work of imagining and creating these alternatives to show that indeed it is possible, we're doing them now. And the media work really, leads well into our third panelist, DJ Cotton Candy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Candy, pronoun she, her, hers, out here in the unceded occupied Kumeyaay territory. I'm nervous to share just because I really thought about my story and wanting to talk about it. And I don't often talk about all of this. But I figured how can I make it tangible for maybe folks in ways that might not understand or know of abolition or are new to understanding abolition. For me, as a Filipinx, as an Asian American, I will speak to my practice of an abolitionist politics that I live based upon how I came to understand it. Even as I couldn't articulate it as a young person, but I always knew within me what were my lived values because they were based upon what I witnessed growing up, what I reflect upon now as an organizer for now 25 years. I was born and raised in Queens, New York City. For those of you that know me, I see a lot of old UCSD folks, shout out, in the room. As a child of two Filipinx immigrant parents, I lived in various areas, including Woodside, Jackson Heights, and then eventually moving to Flushing, Pominock, and Jamaica, Queens. My first year going into high school, a Black student had been shot and killed, and then there was a student walkout happening in protests against the shooting. And even after all the pushback by students, a year later, our high school became the first school in New York City to have metal detectors. So as a young Filipinx going to a predominantly Black, Brown, and Caribbean, West Caribbean, Jamaican, Trinidadian, Guyanese community, I understood early on the experience of policing and police culture and what that was like. Having to go through metal detectors daily, having to wake up at 6 a.m. to go into school in time because you didn't want to be late to class due to long lines, to go through the metal detectors and be randomly checked by security guards. And if it wasn't that you had to go through, it was the paddy wagons and truancy that would pick you up when you hung out at the neighborhood deli, cutting class, because there were teachers that didn't engage with me enough, did not make me feel loved enough, did not make me feel cared for enough, especially when you'd so often run away from home. So you sit in the paddy wagon for hours as they, the truancy, berated you, set fear in you, and guilt you, to then bring you inside with the school principal who would lecture you about hanging outside, victim blame you, should you get raped outside school doors, but yet failing to ever denounce or really protect young girls of color in school from predators and school security guards who often went after the girls. And even then, as I experienced the fear of authority and policing, and even though I didn't know how to name it all or articulate it at the time, I knew early on that as a Filipinx, as an Asian American, that the way I was treated was always different with the way my Black friends were treated. Which brings me to recall how a friend, Bettina Love, from the beginning of their book, We Want to Do More Than Just Survive. From the beginning, they already framed what mattering means to Black lives, in which Bettina says, we who are dark, echoed from W.E.B. Du Bois, we who are dark can see America in a way that white Americans cannot. And I state that here to also share that as an Asian American, as a Filipinx who may and has and does go through my own forms of oppression, I could never understand or have ever experienced or will ever experience the oppression of Black people. I have learned my understanding of abolition through Black feminists, Black abolitionists, and organizers who have strengthened my understanding of my own experiences growing up, who gave me the language to name and make visible the experience I have faced, but have also taught me what solidarity means. And while I understand abolition, practice abolition, continue to forge on the pathway of abolition, I'm always gentle of movement and language and experiences that are not my own, as co-optation and theft of movements and language of Black people, lives and experiences and culture are real. But because I've learned from the Black liberation tradition and believe not just in the dismantling of anti-Black racism, but for pro-Black liberation. Because of this, I must be in solidarity, and I too practice abolition. But here's more of what I know and what I couldn't articulate then. As a young teenager growing up in a home of 26 people living in one household, 3 different families who all came to the Philippines, I found myself constantly being faced with witnessing and experiencing harm, trauma, pain, fear, anger, sexual violence. And even as I cried out sexual violence that happened to myself as a young 16-year-old and for my young relative, nothing was done. No one to save us but myself. And I often wondered why. I kept wondering why no one called the police. But could it be that there was something about that innate feeling that might have had because of experience of colonization and imperialism, that trauma of living through that experience that taught them that perhaps we shouldn't call the police on our family member because we know what that authority feels like. We know what dictatorship is like. We know what militarization is like. We protect our own. But yet the tensions they were and are grappling with and was and is real, because colonialism and imperialism has also conditioned white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, has also conditioned what it means to conform, to assimilate, to live respectability politics, to live in hia and shame. And so often still love and protect the police too. And they will privilege these harmers over the harmed than men over Filipinx young girls, because it is the godly thing to do. And will still keep the sexual violence quiet, hush, and move on about and not doing anything about it. And so through it all, we still lived imprisoned somehow. So when I acted out, when I rebelled, when I ran away from home, and when I was violent, when I was in rage, or when I struggled in school because I didn't know then that I had a learning disability, I'd dip out of school, I'd get into fights, drugs, alcohol, I was beaten, hurt, living in fear and punished. I'd get the police called on me, against me, to our home, and the fear and the abandonment and betrayal of what it was like to have the police brought to my doorstep against me by my own. And no one to ever save me at 16 years old. Only me having to save my relative with a knife to the throat of a predator living in our home, yet no police ever called on him. For years, I felt abandonment, hurt, shame, anger. At times, today when triggered, I still feel those things. I wanted acknowledgement, I wanted understanding, I wanted care, I wanted love. And for a long time, I felt that I would get all of that by punishment, because I was conditioned to think carceral ways were the only way to rectify and the only solution, the only possibility. And what I know now, what I can name now is that if my family had been shown this pathway to abolition, this portal to liberation, could the would have kept everyone safer, including me? I like to believe of those possibilities. I will always dream of possibilities. People often think that abolitionists don't think harm doesn't exist, or that we don't realize there are harmers in this world. Well, as one who has been harmed and who has also harmed, I can tell you we as abolitionists come into this work because we know that harm does exist. We've mentioned Ruth Wilson Gilmer here several times, and they shared, and other abolitionists continue to ask these questions. What are the conditions under which it is more likely that people will resort to using violence and harm to solve problems? What can we do about it so that there is less harm? And one thing that we have learned is where life is precious. Life is precious. As a person with disabilities and as a parent to 2 children with disabilities, I always look to the lead of disability justice organizers, because Mia Minga taught us and lifted more than a decade ago, which has taught me to move towards the ugly. Till this day, that always sits with me. What I mean is this: people with disabilities are often treated as disposable. It should not be a surprise that in the US alone, 26% of the people are disabled and neurodivergent people, and half of those people are killed by the police, as lifted by Talia Lewis, because people with disabilities have always been treated and disposed of and criminalized. Moving towards the ugly rather than perfectionism and desirability politics of who is most desirable will guide us towards an abolitionist practice, where we will understand that perfectionism and desirability is a falsity stemming from a white supremacist heteropatriarchy framing that is ableist. It is ableist because perfection buys into idea of a false norm and a standard that does not exist and should not exist. A false norm, a false belief that creates a condition in which others are more desirable while others are not. I continue to share this because we must understand that none of us are perfect. I'm completely flawed. I'm already implicated. I'm not beyond reproach. I have done harm. We must move towards the ugly rather than leave ourselves haunted by the idea that we must strive towards perfectionism. I strive towards a disability justice practice that is rooted in understanding how it is, and in the words of Talia Lewis, calls an essentialist part of abolishing prisons and police. So I leave you with this in understanding that we must be around the institutionalized, deinstitutionalize, and how we imagine a world free from prisons, bars, and borders, and engage in the practice of dreaming. As mentioned here, practice of imagining is how I do my practice, a constant practice of an Asian feminist accountability, transformative solidarity framework, transformative justice, a politics of accountability and community care, as abolition requires the humility, the political and revolutionary capacity to hold space for ourselves and one another so that we can strive to be Asian imaginaries, potentialities, and live out Asian possibilities, not just for our own, but for the collective liberation of all oppressed peoples where we live in abundance. A framing my good friend Suparna always shares, because the practice of abundance has always allowed us to live our values of reimagining humanity, as it requires never to settle for any less, nor to operate in a framing of scarcity, which Rachel so lovely lifted, but rather dreaming abolition into fruition.
Wow. We did shut off the chat because, you know, with Zoom bombing and trolls and toxicity, but we haven't been getting any toxic questions. If you put a comment into the Q&A, and you know, we will try to pass along to the rest of the group. We've been getting a lot of beautiful things there. People have shared. Yes, so like, thank you, Michelle Tong, who says, wow, 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 the practice of abundance. Thank you, DJ Cutton. It's a lot. So I want to just echo really quickly and admire and respect what you said, Candy, about the intersectionality between sexual violence, gendered violence, and disability violence, violence against disabled folks and people with disabilities in particular, and how abolitionists understand harm. And in fact, abolitionists are doing the practical work around reducing harm, right? And if we don't have a lot of time left in this webinar, so I would like this next place to actually be sort of a conversation as much as possible between the three of y'all. So if you could just do really quickly, just maybe one thing, one example, something you're doing every day as part of your organization. So around maybe how you actually address harm. You know, how do you build alternatives to the prison industrial complex? And we're gonna go in reverse order with Candy and then Rachel and then Paul, but I think feel free to unmute and talk to each other. You know, don't feel like you guys stay muted this whole time. Let's start the conversation now. But Candy, if you're up for it, if you don't mind giving us start off with something from maybe Asian Solidarity Collective or People's Collective for Justice and Liberation.
Thank you so much, everybody, for giving space. I think for us at Asian Solidarity Collective, we really started when a Black man here in El Cajon was shot and killed by the police, was having a mental health breakdown, and us as Asians were coming out to the actions and supporting. And for those of us that knew each other, we all have known each other for quite some time, and but having an organization come together with the radical politics we had, you know, was a rarity, although there was a lot of organizations here as well. And there was a few like in Akbayan here in San Diego. But us as specifically the work that we knew we needed to do, because those of us who are Asian in San Diego, you end up being like the token Asian to get called every single time. And we knew that as an organizer, I have always learned that you're not organizing unless you organize more people into the movement. And it's about collectivity and collectivism, hence our name, Asian Solidarity Collective. And we knew we had work to do, so we started off doing political educational series. We utilized the Asian American Racial Justice Toolkit even though majority of us in our group is professors, we knew, why should we replicate when people are doing such good work nationally and have created this toolkit? And we utilized it and we started building, and people, I don't believe that nobody wants to be an organizer here, and specifically in San Diego, I believe sometimes we just need a space. We need to come together. We need to hone in the conversation. So for us, it's about the political education, and it's about bringing folks together and putting into practice our lived values. It's a constant practice. So for us, we do those educations, we do town halls, we do panels, same thing with People's Collective. We started in March, doing town halls month to month, especially when the COVID-19 emerged. And we started, me and my friend Greg Sindana, amazing organizer, we started doing town halls right when the escalation of anti-Asian racism was already emerging and prominent. And we knew that we had to operate in a framework that was about pro-justice, cross-racial solidarity and liberation. So that was the work that we did, and Asian Solidarity Collective, being who they are, supported us. And even when I wanted to start a mutual aid, my organization supported it again, because we knew that the work is about meeting people where they were at. So me and my good friend Christina started the mutual aid. We got San Diego. And then we knew that they knew that I support my work in the Bail Fund group here in San Diego. So we really operate in coalition building. We partner with organizations like Pillars of the Community, who does work, a Black-led organization that does work around mass incarceration, gang enhancement, gang documentation here in San Diego. So we really build with people on the ground and the work and supporting everybody all across. So much to say, but I want to make room for others.
Thank you. And also, Rachel and Paul, I know you're got a lot to say, but we have a couple of questions. I just want to put them out there in case your comments can address any of these. So one of the panelist questions is, what is the role of community review boards for police? Another question is, what do you think is the temperature check right now in Asian American communities, given COVID-19, the new pandemic, newly visible pandemic of racism, and also as we approach the 2020 election and thinking beyond it. So Rachel, speaking from your work that is national, but also East Coast based, if you want to jump in, and then Paul.
Sure, and I'll also try to answer Judy's question on the temperature check one. So in terms of the Asian American Feminist Collective, one of the ways that we're trying to advance abolitionist politics is through different political education tools, whether that's workshops and zines. And I appreciate Candy for saying, right, it's about how we organize people into movement. So using different points and positions of connection in order to move people, and to use Asian American feminism as an orientation to a set of politics that can be mobilized at moments in time in relation to social and material conditions, right? So including what's happening in this moment of pandemic, and the ways that people are experiencing both heightened policing as well as anti-Asian incidents that are happening in their communities. I think echoing Candy, right, it's really also about the relationships that we build, hold, and practice that is really grounded in the organizing efforts of local communities. So whether that's neighborhood mutual aid groups and the ways that neighborhoods are setting up their infrastructures to create safety for one another and to create spaces for food and housing security where there isn't any, and then also looking to current campaigns and also longstanding community organizations. And so to highlight some of those relationships, we've worked really closely in friendship and coalition with Red Canary Song to decriminalize sex work. And Red Canary is a sex worker-led collective that emerged after police raids and sexual coercion that had led to the tragic death of Yang Song, a massage parlor worker in Flushing. So we've been doing work with them. We also have worked really closely with Equality Labs that brings together caste abolition with the abolition, right, of military, police, and prisons, and thinking about how we also undo carceral logics embedded in our digital spaces. In terms of recent work we've also done that I think also speaks to that question of within Asian American communities, given COVID-19 and what's happening in terms of racism in our communities, we published a letter alongside with 26 other New York City-based Asian American organizations across different diasporic communities that pushes against the creation of an anti-Asian hate crimes NYPD task force. So the NYPD created this task force as a way to address what was happening. But we wanted to offer this letter to say, like, no, this is not like what our communities need. Like, police have never been good for our communities, and really to oppose the uses of hate crime jurisdiction that has expanded systems of policing and punishment. So in terms of the work that we do, it's kind of creating these sets of materials and conversations that people can have to orient to a set of politics. And one of the things we're also thinking about in a really pressing way, right, is how do we build more transnationally and looking to a larger criticism of US militarization and what's also happening abroad as well in terms of how we're thinking about abolition.
Cool, for sure. If I can just ground this in something really quick. Let's distinguish harms from crimes. Let's know that there are two separate things. Not all harms are crimes, not all crimes are harms. Let's talk about that. Another thing I want to ground us in is that society determines what is a crime by labeling some activity or action or inaction as a crime. Society does that. And then I also want to ground this in the thought that society also prepares the conditions for those acts to occur. So I want us to really understand that society prepares the conditions for crimes to occur, and then we label somebody a criminal for doing that act, right? That's what society does. And so part of that system, that ecosystem, is then policing and enforcement, right? Comes with that. And so I want to counter that by saying that when folks are in the community and you go and resolve an issue between your neighbors, you are practicing an alternative to policing. You are practicing abolition in that sense, in a way of that, right? So we do it in our daily lives and things that we don't even recognize. And so I just want to encourage folks to realize that the little deeds that you do when you go to help other people, those are also forms of abolition, right? Abolition doesn't come in just one way that's written, right? There's a lot of things that come together. It's its own kind of cosmos, right? That works its own way out. So I just want to ground us in that. But and so at YJC, we do a lot of work around transformative justice. We do a lot of work around community alternatives to 911. You know, you have to build these alternatives because there's always going to be issues between people. That's just how human nature is. Policing is a way to kind of just intervene or suppress, right? It's not really a way of coming in and supporting people and helping people to resolve issues. They're not there for that. They're there to incarcerate people and keep them incarcerated. And the system, I want to ground us in this too. Something that I've seen in the system is that if somebody went and killed somebody, for example, let's just use that. They will go to the parole board 25, 30 years later. I saw this too. Well, what does the government go do? They go and try to find the next of kin, and they ask them to come relive that harm and that trauma that they've had to hold on to all their life. Because that's the goal of the system. They don't want that person to be healed. Because if they get that person healed, that person will show up and say, man, I forgive this person. You can go ahead and let them go. I'm good. But they don't want that, right? That's part of the system. It's not there to provide folks that healing. The system continues to call them victims. And a lot of folks that we deal with that have been harmed, they don't want to be called victims. They're like, man, I'm a survivor. I hate how the system keeps calling me a victim. I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. Right? So the system is bent in certain ways. It's very retributive, very punitive, et cetera, right? It doesn't, I mean, I'm gonna ask you this question. How many times have you seen a cop walk down the street and go to a business and say, hire somebody that's formerly incarcerated? When have you ever seen that happen? They don't. They try to pass legislation that keeps people in longer. They try to take all the resources. They try to take all the money. That's what they do. And so my engagement at, whether it's city, county, whether it's at the state level, whatever, it's always been about how can we move that money away? I've sat in meetings where I literally saw a sheriff department go in and ask. I just happened to be at a public space. I hopped in and they asked for something. They basically get a line item transfer simple to move the money. And they got like $700,000 for what turned out to be a really fancy X-ray machine, somewhere around there. It was like $400,000 for the equipment and like a contract to maintain it, et cetera, right? But when folks from the community want to go do some work, it's very difficult. You go through hurdles, all kinds of stuff. If you want a government contract, us at YGC, we don't really take government contracts, but that's a different discussion. But there is money out there, right? So when community wants to try to do something, it's so difficult, right? That's part of the system too. So how do we dismantle those things? And so at YGC, there's a lot of work to take the funding away, to divest. Young folks have been asking for 5%. They have a 5% campaign known as LA for Youth. They're trying to move 5% of all the resources that goes to suppression into community centers, into youth jobs, into summer jobs, into support systems, right? To put that in the community, put social workers in the community, put peace builders in the community, outreach workers, et cetera, right? That's one campaign. And to another piece of the work that I've been a part of is in LA County had a plan that they voted in a long time, like about a decade ago or so. They wanted to invest $3.5 billion, pre-financing, pre-bonds, all that stuff to build new jails. And I was a part of that work a couple of years ago towards the end of it. And we actually killed those contracts. Like that's community coming together. That is also a form of abolition, right? And in that space, we were actually also able to create something called the Alternatives to Incarceration work group. And they really took community members and try to find solutions and try to find answers. And they're starting to work to implement all that and put that together. So there are ways to do things. So that's when I say the impossible is not impossible. Like folks at the county level told us, you're not going to get that contract done. That's done. That's already been signed. And next thing you know, we got a vote to shut one contract down. And then we got another vote to shut the other one down. Right? These things are doable. It's just a matter of community getting together to do these things. Because the community has to come forth and say, these are the solutions. Like your solution is not the solution. These are the solutions. The folks that are sitting and living in the struggles know how to get out of the struggles. They know the supports that they need to get there, right? So those are the things that we work on at YGC as a whole. You can talk about gang databases, all kinds of stuff. We're tackling all that stuff day in and day out. But to the question about civilian review boards, in LA County, we do have something called the Civilian Oversight Commission. It's a civilian board overseeing, they don't really oversee, they're advisory. So they don't have any actual teeth, but they're kind of watchdogs over the sheriff's department. And we have a lot of community folks on there that are supportive and helpful in getting good recommendations out. The LAPD also has a police commission. They actually have authority and power, but they don't always do much. So that's the one dilemma that I've seen happen. It's when you give a civilian review board power, they don't really do much. The ones without power actually put out some good recommendations, but the recommendations really have no bite without more community pressure to get those things implemented. So there's all these challenges. But I do want to say on that note that in every space that I've been in, whenever there's been bodies that are being created or bodies that are already there, we always push to get community members on. That's the same thing with the CalVIP ESC that I mentioned earlier. That's community pushing to get me on there. Like folks asked and reached out. And next thing you know, I'm getting a call from the Board of State and Community Corrections. Hey, we want to be on this committee because we need folks in the community in those spaces. And so that's just an important thing that I just want to share. Anywhere we go, if you're talking about civilian boards, community-based boards, whatever, just make sure that you get community folks on there. And even on the ones where it's full of like police officers and stuff, we also need folks in the community on there. We need to be able to steer those conversations because those are the bodies that tend to get listened to, right? So those are the places that we need to impact. And it's always good to put impacted people on those spaces. That's the other thing I want to share. It's not always about getting somebody that's just from community, but somebody that's impacted, somebody that can go and say, this is my experience. I don't know what to tell you. This is what happened. Because they can argue against statistics, they can argue against data, they can argue, rebut your reports or whatever, but they cannot argue with your lived experience. Like this is what happened because you spent $1 billion on policing in my community, right? Rather than spending 100 million on the sidewalks, for example, right? Rather than investing in, those are like real tangible things that you can bring to those spaces. But in terms of, as far as the kind of Asian American community as a whole, the temperature check question, I just want to remind folks that if we go back in history, right, we always have to look back at history. Like slavery wasn't something that enslaved folks weren't fighting against. They put their bodies on the line for that. No matter if a bullet was going to come at them, they went and did it. And that's the only way. We have to invest ourselves. We have to invest our bodies, our lives. We have to go as far as we can go. Because if we just sit in the sidelines and we hide, all the narratives are outside of us are always going to be there and they're going to get stronger because we have to be the ones to push back because we're the ones getting impacted by it. We have to come and we have to be our own help. like we can't rely on others to help us because we're going to get solutions we don't want, right? That's an important thing that I've seen happen over and over again. So those are a lot of the things that come to mind on those conversations. But yeah, as an organization as a whole, like just check us out on Instagram. You'll see more. I don't want to belabor it, but you can check us out at Youth Justice LA. You'll see a whole lot. But yeah, for sure. I don't want to take up too much time.
Well, thank you, Paul, because I do think we're trying to put the resources out there. We'll have the stuff on websites, and so folks can do this and also continue the conversations in the communities that you're in. I want to acknowledge the people who've been speaking with their hands. I've been saying this word a lot. I don't know what it means, but I have my suspicions that it's something to do with the collective. And in the spirit of the Combahee River Collective, particularly Margot Ozawa Ray, who's an elder, who's one of the original members. I hear from Rachel that she always ends her panels with a dance party and music. I do think we should turn ourselves to the joy in this work, and let's just keep it simple. And if you could just tell me, for joy, what are you reading? What television shows are you watching? What trashy YouTube videos? You know, what do you do for joy? And if you could just shout out what you're doing, Paul, Candy, and Rachel, that'd be great.
Does anybody want to go?
Yeah, go.
The silence.
Joy for me, I make it simple. It's just the young folks that I work with and being able to reciprocate the love that they gave me. And I say that because when I came home, a lot of places shut me out. They said, you know, you're got a record, you know, we don't know how to help you. Or in some cases, they're like, you got to put a suit and a tie and hang with us a few years before we're going to go do what you're asking us to do. You know, so it was a lot of that. But with the young folks, every single time, hands down, they were like, man, what can we do? How can we support you? Like, where do we got to go mobilize? Like, who do we call? It was always more of that. And it was always that love. So my joy has definitely been just sharing space with young folks and just reciprocating the love that they shown me that ultimately got me to pardon and got me to stay. And so that's where my joy comes from.
For me, thank you, Paul, for sharing your joy. And thank you for this reminding question with joy. For me, it's definitely my children, my two children. Just last week, my Soul, who's 4 years old, asked me, was crying, came here crying into the room, and was really, really sad because he accidentally bumped into Miracle, who's 5, and Miracle had like a bump in their nose, and he felt so bad and so guilty, and he was crying. And I told Soul, like, please don't feel bad because it was an accident, and you know why you're crying? Because it means you care, it means you love, and it means, and it's a good thing that you care. And he felt better, and just that alone brought me a lot of joy because I'm trying to raise my children. You know, we're so conditioned to act carceral, even how we raise our young ones, and punishment and bad and versus good. And I want to bring intentionality in how I do and how I live my values. So my children really, really bring me joy, and they show me how to do better all the time.
Rachel.
I love that. I think for me, so I'll answer like the broader sense of joy. I think from doing a lot of this work, the kinds of friendships that have now been created, I think for me is something that brings me like so much happiness to be able to now to have like a community of people that when like things feel weird or like there's different conflicts happening, that like you can text someone really quickly, either through like a series of emojis or a quick question, and feel really heard and understood in this moment. I think that's something that gives me a lot of life, is to have spaces to do that. I'm also reading this book, The World of Wonders, in praise of fireflies, whale sharks, and other astonishments. It's a really beautiful book with short essays that kind of compares like different experiences with kind of like fun animal facts. And there's like really, it's like really beautiful little illustrations. So I've been reading that book for fun and joy. And so I think, yeah, so that's like something fun that I'm reading. I'm also reading less fun things, but I'll share that as like a fun piece of essays. And thank you, Nancy, for dropping that into the chat. But I love this question about joy so much, because I think the question that I have been ruminating on, especially to be in conversation with you, Candy and Paul, is really like how you're both navigating this kind of rapid response and longer term movement visions, and having the like kind of longer term sustainability drive the rapid response, because I have been feeling like we're just like living in crisis all the time. And so this kind of question of joy and finding joy in these different spaces, I think is one that is a helpful reminder. And I think even the pause before we were all able to answer what brings us joy is really indicative that it is like, sometimes it's like, there's like this moment of pause or a moment of slowing down that needs to happen to remember that in order to kind of like move forward and do this work.
Well, right on, everyone. Thank you for this time. I'm just going to end with shouting out Simeon Mann again and the new AAPI minor at UC San Diego, but all the unseen labor behind this: Anna Marie Benviaje, Anthony King, Nancy Kwok, our interpreters, Arthur Cosentino and Joni Dunn. So appreciations to the 466 people who registered. Please make this conversation and this imagination a collective reality. Goodbye, everybody.